over to that area. So without further ado, Father Jim.
Thank you, Father Tony. Those of you who don't know me really well are probably wondering, why did I leave Ohio and come to the Panhandle of Texas? But I usually tell people the answer is a two-prong answer. I came out here around the late 1990s because I became acquainted with some folks from Nazareth, Texas through the Catholic Rural Life Conference. I grew up on a family farm in Ohio, and so throughout my priesthood, I was very interested in rural ministry. And so I belonged to the Catholic Rural Life Conference. I met these folks from Nazareth, and so I started coming out here to visit them on vacation. I was going down to Mexico to work on my Spanish one year, and I decided on the way back, I gave them a call because I'd never been to Texas. I asked if I could come and visit them. And, they worked cattle with their horses, and I broke horses on the side. And so I started coming out here, and then Bishop Ianta put a bug in my ear saying, this is a mission diocese, and we could really use some help. So that's the noble reason. I came out here to help you all. But then there's another reason. I found out that your ground out here is a lot cheaper than in Ohio. So I was able to buy a little piece of ground over by Kittiquay, and that's where I'm living full time now. And that old saying about you can take the boy off the farm, but you can't take the farm out of the boy. That's really true for me, and you'll hear a little bit of that in some of the examples that I bring up tonight. But anyway, I'm just really honored to be asked to be here tonight and to share some of my stories, and in hopes of calling forth from yourself and your own memories some of your stories. The title of this series, this two-part series, is Telling Our Stories in Christ. And I often think that this business of telling stories is and when we see how those overlap, it broadens our appreciation of this deep mystery, which St. Paul describes as being part of God. He said it this way. He says, we live and move and have our being in God. And then when you put that with our Catholic culture, and you read the first line from the first letter of St. John, you realize how this story is not just something that we pass on with words, but it's a part of the way we live and move and have our being. St. John's opening line in his letter is, something we have heard and seen, something we have touched with our hands, the Word who is life. This is what we preach. In other words, the Word, the Logos, is eternal. And we are caught up into that story of God's eternal giving of himself. And as we give ourselves to God, we become a part of this epic, this adventure that includes all of history, from the fall of creation to the hope of the prophets to the waiting of God's people all those centuries, and then the whole story of the church and the scriptures and the lives of our saints and the people we know today and the families with whom we live. And it's just this wonderful way of savoring this thing called grace. So how do we do this? Last night I mentioned that there's two ways to kind of nurture this attitude, this perspective of living in God. Two small little steps, little practices. One is paying attention, noticing details, and then looking for the overlap. A lot of times, God sneaks in. I mentioned the story about this African-American nurse on this medevac helicopter coming in and giving us a demonstration one night at Turkey. I'm part of the search and rescue team at Cap Rock Canyons. And those of you who were here last night remember the story about how she was talking about working on patients in this tiny little cubicle of this medevac helicopter that they came out to demonstrate how we can better help them when we have to call in a helicopter. And I mentioned to her, I said, man, there's no room for a priest to get in there to give last rites. And she said, oh, Jesus squeezes in. He's right in there. We say a prayer every time before we take off. He needs us and we need him. And that's the truth. God is there. Sometimes you just have to notice a little detail and, as I mentioned last night, time kind of stops. Time stands still. And the Bible has a word for that. It's kairos. Chronos is chronological time that we measure, but every once in a while we get these experiences of kairos where time stands still. It's a taste of eternity. And a lot of times, believe it or not, it shows up in small little details that you otherwise overlook. Like talking to a young man and his wife after Mass one Sunday at Spearman, finding out that he climbs wind turbines for a living. And I say, man, that keeps you in good shape. And he says to me, yeah, not just physical shape, spiritual shape. I love climbing up there and looking out that door and seeing this beautiful, vast plain of Texas. And so his name was Daniel, but afterward I got to thinking, this is like talking to Jacob, who climbed that ladder. For him, the angels are climbing up and down that ladder to heaven. And so when you notice these interesting little connections, the way God's story is reflected into ours, it's just very, very moving. And it changes you. It alters your perspective. And what we're going to talk about tonight is how important it is to develop that discipline of paying attention and noticing the overlap. And you realize that you are part of something much bigger than you normally realize. Like the time I had that conversation with this old man who was putting up the wall block for the addition over there at St. Hyacinth's Church. And in the course of our conversation, I discovered that his uncle and aunt owned a ranch in Mexico during the Cristero War where they hid 20 Franciscan seminarians and 2 priests. And suddenly, for me, time stopped. I said, you're kidding. You're building the wall of our church. You're part of a family that hid seminarians during a time of persecution. One of those priests was apprehended. He was tortured. He was killed. And the story of God breaks in. So I think sometimes when we talk about telling stories, we're just thinking, we're being interesting. Hopefully, we're finding a little bit of entertainment. But God uses stories in a very special way to help realize that we are a part of his story. We're part of the story of Christ living in this world, part of the story of the church, and how wonderful that is. So we talked about how our stories are already enfolded within the story of God. Paying attention to detail, noticing the connections, helps us realize how close God is to us, how close we are to him. So now tonight, we're going to start the second part of the series, and we're going to focus on stories of hope and stories of healing. We're going to start with stories of hope. Last night, we spoke about how when we share stories, one of the things that you want to look for or kind of use as a gauge about when is this appropriate, when is this helpful to people, is when it feels natural. You don't want to force your story on somebody else. It's like it ends up being counterproductive. But you know, when we are with family, stories come natural, and those stories are far more important than we generally realize. So I would like to begin there and encourage you always to do whatever you can to help the children in your family or the grandchildren that you have to keep their eyes open for these connections between their life and God's life. And when you start looking for grace, as I often say, it starts to show up all over the place. A good place to begin to develop this personal discipline, like daily prayer, it's the same, you said, I'm going to be conscious. I'm going to try to remember to pray during certain hours of the day. And at times we get busy and other things come in. But if you can, especially during times like Advent, when we want to sharpen our attention for the presence of God, a good way to start is not being general, but look for the specific things. How do these small little things in our life connect to the things of heaven? And they're there. All you have to do is notice them. Take for an example, here's a blessing for a kitchen. And it's a great blessing insofar as it makes really neat connections from ordinary things to the things of the gospel and the actions of Christ. It starts this way. Lord, bless these cupboards, stocked with spoons, bowls, plates, pots, and pans. For indeed, you once fed thousands with 5 loaves and 2 fish received from a child's hand. Lord, bless the refrigerator, the stove, and oven. As you cause dough to rise with flakes of yeast, so may joy and banter lift the spirits of all who are nourished with food from this kitchen. And bless this sink, dishwasher, and towels. Help us wash our souls of leftover sins and infractions. Help us savor your blessings and not waste the grace that you provide. Are you hearing the connections with family meals, little kids? Don't waste that. Wash your hands. Make these connections. They're there. They're just waiting to be made. May this family follow your example of sharing fellowship with your friends and washing their feet. May they never forget that the Eucharist, the greatest of all sacraments, was instituted at a table like this. Aren't we blessed to have this ordinary life of ours be gilded with the gold of eternal life? It's there. You just have to sharpen our eyes. And it's a wonderful way to deepen, to savor this mystery of living in God. I mentioned last night as well that as Catholics, we have this advantage of being a sacramental church. Our faith is very tactile, I work at the prison in Childress part-time, and most of the believers, they have a faith-based dorm, and it's a wonderful thing. And you can be any faith, Jew, Muslim, Christian, evangelical, Baptist, Roman Catholic. These prisoners get to spend a whole year focusing on nothing but religion, their religion, other people's religion, and how that can help them grow in virtue. And I understand that at least every penitentiary in the Panhandle now has faith-based dorms. They've only been around for like 2 or 3 years. It's wonderful. It's the only program in the penitentiary that's devoted to building character. I really enjoy working there. But I've noticed, of course, with the evangelical Christians, and God love them, I mean, they're really enthused, but their starting point is always the Bible. And God bless them. Our starting point is the Bible too, but they're really intense on the Bible. and when it comes to the sacraments, when it comes to the lives of the saint, when it comes to the history of the church, they're weak. And to their credit, they find this all very interesting, and I love to share it with them. But of course, as you find here in the Panhandle a lot, they all think we worship Mary. And I always remind them, no. The rosary it's the gospel in a chain. It's rooted in the gospel, and how I said the Hail Mary is background music. We're focusing on these 4 sets of mystery that take you from the Annunciation, to the crucifixion, to the resurrection, to, well, okay, not the gospel in particular, but to the woman clothed with the sun in the book of Revelation. Okay, it's a way of making your way through the Bible without reading it, rather touching it. And if you have children in your home, if you have grandchildren to come visit, the rosary can be expanded to really highlight, or what would you say, emphasize that connectivity between ordinary life and God's life. Now, I grew up in a devout family home, and every Lent we would say the rosary at night, and as a kid it was really hard to sit through all of that. And I don't know if you might consider shortening the decades to maybe 3 or 5 rosaries, Hail Marys, maybe keep the kids a little more interested. But you know what else would help them appreciate the rosary at an earlier age? If you would augment it with some visuals, like a good teacher does, So this would be one way to kind of help those children get off on this habit, developing this habit early, to see more than meets the eye, which is what we Catholics are good at. We can see a bowl of potatoes on the table, and we can think, oh wait, table, meal, Jesus, apostles, okay, holy, okay. There's these connections between the Sunday Eucharist and that meal that you're eating at home. The more that they can be led to make those connections. The rosary is a really neat way to do that. I don't know if you ever thought about it, but if you got some little kids, do a rosary pilgrimage through the house. And so let's say you're doing the joyful mysteries, and when you get to the first joyful mystery about the Annunciation, well, maybe you lead them to the table, and you happen to have an invitation to a baby shower. Gabriel came to announce that Mary was going to have a baby. This invitation we got from Aunt Ruth, her daughter's going to have a baby, and we're going to go over there and celebrate that. Or you get to the visitation. You take them to the garage, and you say a few Hail Marys there, and you remind them of how Mary went to visit Elizabeth. She didn't have a car, but by golly, she went to visit. So they make this connection. Who do you go visit? Who's God called us to go visit lately? And what was the occasion? What was the good news that he had to share when we went to visit our relatives? Okay, the nativity. Obviously, this time of the year, you can take them to the Christmas tree and the nativity set if you have that set up already. But other times of the year, you might put out their birth certificate. And as you pray about Jesus' birth, you take the time to share with them a little story about their birth. What was the weather like that day? Who was the first person to hold you in your life? Oh my gosh, these kids will never forget that. And then they're connecting this to the story of Christ. You can go on and on. The presentation of Jesus in the temple. Dig out an old picture of the day that they were baptized. And, we brought you to church just like Mary and Joseph brought Jesus to the temple. Oh, interesting. Okay. Then they find Jesus in the Father's house. Get a church bulletin. Most of our bulletins have a picture of our church. This is God's house. We go there on Sunday. What do you like about God's house? What's your favorite thing about God's house? Okay, so for us in our Catholic faith, we're not really good at memorizing Bible verses. But for us, the Bible is a story, and we play a role in that wonderful, wonderful story. Some wonderful ways in which this overlapping of story can take place. I call it overlapping. I came across an article not too long ago that presents it in a more poetic light. This woman, her name is Denise Truel, She's a Catholic writer. Here it is. Okay. No wonder I can't find my pages. Thank you. But she's a really fine writer. She writes a lot of fiction. But listen to how she talks about how God enters into our life through his story. She says, God willed to entwine himself in each of our hearts when he came to earth. And from our hearts grow vines to other hearts. God takes deep root and is not easily extracted. He takes deep root. He did not just come down to earth and then ascend without a trace. When he came as a seed to Our Lady's womb, he began to grow. And through her story, he also took root in Joseph's heart and in the hearts of shepherds and kings who also shared their stories with others. Like a gorgeous, slow-growing vine wrapping itself around our hearts and binding us one to another through words about the Word. This is why the mystical body of Christ is so vital. We learn of the heart of God through the stories of the saints and even each other's stories. Revelation is never a private matter. We must learn to listen to each other, for God has so much to say. Isn't that beautiful? And of course, the connection to the Bible. Christ is the vine, we are the branches. That section in one of the Psalms where it talks about, may your wife be like a fruitful vine in your home, and your children like olive plants around your table. You know, all we have to do is stop for a moment, once in a while. Where are the connections? You know, and those connections make us realize that, you know, these stories of ours and God's stories, they merge, they become one. So this whole business of telling stories is much deeper than we normally give it credit. It's not just a matter of entertainment. It's a matter of seeing life more deeply. You know, in fact, I heard once the distinction between entertainment and art. You know, a lot of times movies are an art, but there's a slight difference. When our entertainment leads us to kind of float on the surface, it's entertainment. But when we go see something, a piece of art, a really good movie, a beautiful painting, we go to listen to beautiful music, it's more than entertainment. It leads us down deep. So stories function the same way. Some stories are lighthearted, and that's great, and they can carry an important message, but as we said last night, sometimes when we share our stories, we are really sharing our souls. So what happens at the kitchen table, what happens in our day-to-day prayers and devotions, this also then floats out and becomes a part of our day-to-day life. And again, as Roman Catholics, you know, there's this continuum from what we do here in church to what we do in the world. I have a good friend who grew up in California, and she became Catholic during her high school years. And I asked her once, I said, Darlene, why did you become Catholic? She said, well, whenever I visited the friends of my, the homes of my Catholic friends, their houses were like churches. they were full of all these religious images, and I thought, this is really different. And so she started to gravitate toward that different feel that a Catholic home has. And then when we can leave our homes and carry the same kind of attitude or feeling out into the world, as you know, the teaching of the church constantly reminds us, the laity, through your work, consecrate the world. You bring the kingdom of God, the story of God, out into the world. And it doesn't matter if you bale hay or weld steel. It doesn't matter if you teach math or change bedpans or change diapers. It doesn't matter if, if you lay asphalt. Your work is important. Everyone's work is important and necessary, and it is holy. I knew a Franciscan sister once who spent a number of years working in Africa, and I remember her talking about how their masses last so much longer, and one of the reasons is because the offertory is so long. And here the offertory is just like intermission. But man, where she was, and I often thought about this, oh man, I wish we could have something of this. When offertory time comes, everybody gets up and they leave and they go to the doors of the church where they have left their gifts. And so they come in bringing their gifts. And these gifts are goats, squawking chickens, baskets of corn, and they bring them up to the altar. So, their work is their gift to God. Your daily work is your daily gift to God, and it's at the altar where it is made holy. So again, personal discipline in sharpening your eye for where God is at work. When you come to the offertory of the Mass, that's not our custom here, but if you happen to be feeding a family, imagine placing a box of cereal next to the chalice. If you're a roofer, imagine placing your gloves next to the missal. If you're a truck driver, imagine dropping your keys in the paten with the host. If you're a nurse at that time of the Mass and you notice the priest washing his hands, well, think about the patients that you have bathed that week. If you're retired, imagine placing a rosary at the base of one of the altar candles as a sign of all the prayers that you prayed throughout this week for all the people in your family and the folks that you love. Because it's at the Mass that our daily work is consecrated. It becomes part of the work of Christ, who hung out with fishermen, who was a carpenter, and who also happens to be the very Son of God. Just to grasp, and that's why I think during the season of Advent that to talk about story and the overlapping of our stories with the story of God is really, really appropriate. And it's more important than we realize, because this is what gives us hope. We all know that our country right now is in a state of, it's down in the dumps. We have tremendous rise, from what I read, in deaths by despair. What does that mean? It's because people have lost hope. They're losing hope. What gives hope? A hopeful story. Because when life begins with birth and ends with death, there's no horizon, and everything flattens out. But when we can see how God's story and our story is connected together, we're given hope. And that hope makes all the difference. Now, I'm showing my age here a bit, but I remember when there was a time when every day we had 6 o'clock news, 11 o'clock news, 30 minutes each. What is it now? Oh my guys, we're inundated with all the tragedy from all over the world. But that's not the entire story. I mean, just look at the story of our life here in the Panhandle of Texas. We need to shine a light on the hope, a very critical purpose of the church right now. Okay, so we know about this terrible conflict in the Holy Land between the Jews and the Arabs. I was filling in for the priest up at Cactus just maybe a month and a half ago. But there's a mosque in Cactus. There's all kinds of religions in Cactus. Father Hugo is a pastor there, next to the church. Because of the needs of the packing plant, a whole lot of Somalians have moved in. Well, he's got his parish organized, and they're making sure that they feel welcome. A whole lot of Guatemalans have moved in. And well, they're Hispanic, but they don't speak Spanish. They speak Quinche, their own language. And so in this parish, this Hispanic parish, they're welcoming these new Guatemalans, but they don't speak the same language. But you know what? He said, they're so fervent in their faith. And so they make sure they get they get the books that are in their language as well. And you know, what a better story. And it's real. It's just up the road. You know, to remember that story is, the story of what's happening in the Holy Land is horrible. But it's not the only story. And there's stories that counteract that story. It's called the story of love. Okay? Or, you know, I mentioned that little picture hanging in the sacristy here. I noticed when I was filling in here last night, and it was painted by the grandmother of a good friend of mine. And her family helped start the Catholic Church in Clarendon. I said, oh man, I'm you know, what's that old thing about there's only 6 degrees of separation? You know, we're connected to a lot more people than we realize. But you know, I don't know if you've ever noticed the school up in the Heights, named the park rather, named for Bones Hooks. Do y'all know who Bones Hooks is? Oh man, I'm so glad I can tell you. You know, a number of years ago we had all that racial tension in this country. You know, after the death of the recent one that caused all the right, Floyd. Yeah, and you know, and we know that racial tension is a reality of American life. But Bones Hooks is a counter story. Bones Hooks was a former slave, and he came to the Panhandle, became one of the best cowboys who ever lived. He could break a horse that nobody could ever touch. You know, I got a good friend down in Kittaquay. He's African American. He's a cowboy, and I'm thinking, you know, here's our present day Bones Hooks. You know, we're much closer to our history than we tend to realize. And I remember EJ telling me, he said, yeah, you know, when I did high school rodeo down there at Silverton, I was pretty good. I remember one guy coming up to me and said, you're going to be putting Silverton on the map. You know. So, you know, we have these other stories of hope and encouragement, and they connect us to each other. We're all children of God, regardless of our religion or our ethnic background. Or, you know, that's the deeper story that Christ constantly reminded us of. So it's good for us to know those stories because they give hope. They're stories of hope. I had a couple of others written down if I can find the right page here. I should pay more attention to my outline. Yeah, you know, we have, just to the east of us, we have that beautiful monument of the cross, that gigantic cross, a groom. You know, if you look up on the internet, you'll find out that 9,000 people drive past that cross and continue on their way every day. But 1,000 stop. 1,000 people stop every day at Groom because of that cross. You know? And that's here in our diocese. You know? We hear about you know, the growing problem with drug use, serious problem. But you know, my last parish was St. John the Evangelist up in Borger. And one of my parishioners there, a convert to the Catholic faith, Judge James Mosley. And about a half a year before I became pastor, he started a drug court. I'd never heard of a drug court. But what an amazing thing. I ended up getting involved with it quite a bit. A drug court is an alternative to prison, where people who are addicted to drugs and arrested, if they meet certain qualifications, and up there in Hutchinson County, they would take in the most desperate of cases, Like one of the requirements was that you had to have been homeless for 6 months. That was a requirement to get into the program. So they're very, very down and out people. But Judge Mosley started this program where instead of going to prison, they go, it's a very strenuous program, high expectations, but they get to stay in the community. Now, some people who qualify actually choose to go to prison because the requirements are pretty stiff. For one, you have to be drug tested every week, and it's a 3-year program. So you're tested every week, different kinds of tests. You have to maintain a job. You have to go to individual counseling every week, group counseling every week, see your parole officer every week, appear before the judge every week. But you know, the result is that if someone successfully completes a drug court program, they'll reoffend 30% of the time. But if they go to prison and come out, they reoffend 70% of the time. So that's a story of hope here in our diocese. And it's important to draw upon those, to counteract this 24-hour barrage of manipulative news that just wants you all to believe that everything's going to hell in a handbasket, you know. You don't want to deny the reality, but at the same time, part of the reality is the life of Christ at work in us. And we need to take hold of that and share the stories of faith. And it's like looking for the details. When you look for them, you can find them. They're all over. How many of you are familiar with the story of Blessed Stanley Rother? Okay, about half of you. If you haven't read about him, look him up on the internet. There's a fabulous little 20-minute video called An Ordinary Martyr. Blessed Stanley, okay, I told you I was a farm boy. He was a farm boy, okay? He grew up on a farm in Oklahoma, a little town called Okarche. He's actually the same age as my oldest brother. And if you look at this video, he's wearing an FFA jacket in high school. He's showing an Angus steer at the county fair. And now he's going to be a saint. In fact, they just built a shrine in his honor in Oklahoma City. It's the largest church in Oklahoma. He wasn't a good student. The seminary told him to go back home. He couldn't understand Latin. But his bishop was impressed with this guy because he was a hard worker, he's a hands-on fellow. He found him another seminary. They got him to pass that Latin test. After a few years of being ordained, he volunteered to help in the Oklahoma mission in a town of Guatemala. And lo and behold, he's taken their native language and he's translating the New Testament into it. So he helped the farmers in their fields. He started a medical clinic. He started a school. An amazing guy, very non-political. But unfortunately, a civil war broke out at the time he was there. And he was in this parish for 12 years. And then his name ended up on a death list. And the bishop called him home. But he couldn't rest here. There's a biography of him called The Shepherd Who Did Not Run. And he talked to his bishop after a few months and they're letting him go back. His name had been removed from the death list. But of course, it was only a few months before they broke into his rectory and they killed him. He was a martyr. Just an ordinary farm kid from Oklahoma. So if you got a teenager in your family, a kid or a grandkid, and they're kind of down on themselves or down in the dumps, use his story. It's one of hundreds, but it's close by, and it's somebody that a lot like us in a lot of ways, you know. Grew up in an ordinary family and ended up just giving his all, you know. Or you got a young girl in your family and she's depressed and she's doesn't think she's worth anything, you know. Well, remind her that, you know, in the book of Revelation, it promises that someday, and a lot of people don't know this little detail, but it's a beautiful little detail, and I think it's one that would appeal to a young girl very much, that at the end of our life, we appear before God. He's going to give us a white stone. And on that stone will be our name, that only he and us know. You talk about giving someone a sense of importance, honor. It's there. It's in the stories, and those stories are our story as well. So that's a little bit about stories of hope. We're going to move on now and talk a little bit about stories of healing. They too are stories of hope. A story of healing, I think when you're listening to someone's story or you're aware of their story and you feel a little bit of a twinge inside of yourself and you identify with them, that's a sign. There's not only a little bit of hurt, but it's a hurt that you share. And that opens a door, at least occasionally. It's a whole different experience of being like Job's friends and saying, hey, pick yourself up by the bootstraps. Come on, you'll get over it. Yeah, it's bad, but move on. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but in the book of Job, for the first 7 days after his friends arrive, they just sit there in silence. They don't say a thing. And that's really a very good example for us. They didn't speak until Job spoke to them. And then when they started talking, they decided to kind of take control of things. And when it comes to stories of healing, the sharing is more important than the sharing in the pain is more important than trying to control the outcome or try to move them on. That's between them and God. But when there's stories of pain and you feel a little bit of someone else's pain because it's somewhat similar to your pain or it touches something in you, it calls for a third story. The story of Christ, the story of the cross. I got a good friend here who's a surveyor, and he told me a story once about how here in the Panhandle in the late 1800s, when they were surveying this area, they would do their measurements for the townships, and you may have heard of them called section markers. They start from a section marker, which marks the corner of a township. So correct me if I get this wrong, Shane. But sometimes they got to spend a whole lot of time out in the fields looking for a pile of rocks because that's what they used as a section marker from over 100 years ago. Where did that pile of rocks go? If they can't find that, they can't make accurate measurements for surveying the power lines or whatever it is, property lines that they need to survey. But then also there are times when they would use a tree. And of course, in this part of the country, a tree stands out. There aren't too many of them. If it was a tree in the old records, they would call it a witness tree. And that witness tree is where they would get their bearings. Everything would come and be measured from this tree. And I love that term, witness tree. It reminds me of the cross. I'm currently reading a book right now written by an evangelical pastor. It's called Between Two Trees. The tree in the Garden of Eden with the forbidden fruit, and the tree with the leaves of healing in the New Jerusalem. Between those two trees is the tree of the cross. And the cross is where we get our bearing. And of course, the cross is what brings us healing. And healing presupposes a type of pain, a sort of dying. Let me share with you a story I wrote for my blog. I mentioned that, just give me a minute while I shuffle through these papers. I mentioned that I volunteer down at the Children's Penitentiary. I teach a couple courses and I do spiritual direction. Here it is. Having grown up on a farm, and all my family are farmers, I have a deep affection for that way of life. But of course, it's a way of life that is passing. Here in the Texas Panhandle, for example, we have these huge grain elevators. But I don't know if you're aware of it, but but the majority of them are empty. There was a time when there were 1,500 elevators, grain elevators in Texas. Now only a third of them report for duty. So most of these elevators are empty. And they're starting to show their age. They're falling apart. But every time I pass one of those old elevators, I can't help but think of my dad. And my dad had a lot of influence. I mentioned last night about one of my first stories of learning about the faith was helping him, not helping, I was just throwing wood into the trailer, but he was clearing a fence row. And we have these locust trees in Ohio with huge thorns. And he brought one over to me and said, Jimmy, these are the kind of thorns they used on Jesus. My dad was just a good, hard-working man and deeply devout. So anyway, that's part of the pain I'm feeling here. I still miss the guy, But let me read this to you, and then we'll comment about this as a story of healing as well as hope. I seldom pass grain elevators without recalling my dad. I see him in the field breaking off heads of wheat, then rubbing the grains between his fingers. If he judged them to be sufficiently dry, he would head off to the elevator in town to test a sample of it. Later that afternoon, I'd be whistling happy, hauling wagons loaded with wheat to the same elevator. I'd listen to the rumble of the augers beneath the wood plank floor, nod to neighbors in the office, collect a weight slip, and then return home to hitch to another wagon already filled to the brim. Today, a young man sits across from me in a room with barred windows. I've been a spiritual director for more than a year. During our sessions, we ponder God's plans for his life when he gets paroled. When that day arrives, he will likely be released to a city similar to the one from which he came. As his spiritual father, this leaves me feeling inept. I am unfamiliar with the streets on which he grew up, and I worry about him returning to his former way of life. I would give anything to steer him to a time when men wore work gloves instead of tattoos, a time when weekends meant square dancing, and sexual intimacy was wedded to a life of sacrifice. Today, his eyes are earnest, his intentions sincere, but I can't help but notice that his hands folded on the desktop between us, those fists of his have fought some tough fights, but his palms have never weighed handfuls of grain. And that's the deep truth of our faith. I mean, in my life and in his life. Unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains just a grain of wheat. But if it dies, it produces much fruit. So here's a young man. There's me with my history. There's him with his history. Where do they overlap? In the dying, in the trusting, and the hope that God will bring new life from our suffering. Be it addiction, be it poverty, be it homelessness, whatever. From that death springs life eternal. And this is where we get our bearings, from the cross, the witness tree, the tree that witnesses to a life that's deeper, so deep. And all we have to do is notice how deep it is. Notice a few little things, and we get a sense of swimming in this thing we call grace. I don't know if any of you here are involved with Colby Prison Ministries, but we have tremendous work being done in this diocese by lay people who come into these prisons, and I've seen it. I've not been involved with the whole weekend. I come in, I hear confessions, I do mass, etc. But I hear about them later, And this is a secret. Don't tell anybody this. If you know someone who's got a relative in prison right now. At the end of the Colby retreat, these inmates, oftentimes belonging to rival gangs. So let me tell you, if you're having a bad day, just think about what goes on in a prison. It's terrible. The gangs are in control of those cell blocks. I worked with the guys in the faith-based dorm. They're living in heaven. I occasionally hear stories about the cell blocks. But at the end of the Colby retreat, you'll have guys from different gangs who won't talk to each other, washing each other's feet. And they bawl. They bawl. It's just amazing. You know, when you take God's story and you give it expression, you let it touch you. You touch others through that story. It makes all the difference. And the cross is where it's where it all congeals. You know, as a priest, you know, well, we all have experiences in our families of this transition and this mystery of death and the pain and the suffering. But as people of faith, we also see glimmers of light. I had an example of I wanted to share with you of a young mother who, one evening at the end of the day, she lost her husband in a rollover accident. He was coming home from work. And I was their pastor. They had 2 little girls. So I go to their house, and of course everybody's there, and everyone is weeping. And I remember sitting next to Jessica on the couch and overcome with grief. And she's hugging her little girls, and she's crying. And between her gasp of air, every once in a while she'd say, "I'm so glad." And I'm thinking, what are you talking about? She's, "I'm glad, I'm so glad." And then when she would catch her breath, I say, "Jessica, what are you glad about?" She said, "The last thing Juan did before he left the house, he traced the sign of the cross on our girls' foreheads. That will be the last thing they remember about him. I am so glad he remembered to do that this morning before he left." The power of the cross. I'll share with you a story from my own family. My grandmother, who, like every grandmother, was the best grandmother in the world. I may be told this story here a few weeks ago. I don't remember. If you heard it before, you just have to listen to it again. But our grandmother lived on the farm across from our farm, and just a gentle soul. And one day, me and my brothers, we found out she was coming to live with us. And we said, "Oh man, this is great. Grandma was going to come and live with us," but then it didn't take too long before we figured out why. She needed help. And it didn't take too much long after that. She no longer remembered our names. She had, back then they called it hardening of the arteries. I'm showing my age again. She had Alzheimer's. And by the time she died, it was hard. I remember we'd be having supper at the kitchen table, but Grandma would be in the family room sitting on a hardback chair looking around the corner checking in on us. And we say, "Well, Granny, come sit down. We got your plate." "Oh, no. She wouldn't do that." We couldn't figure out what was going on. And then my mother put it together. When my grandmother was young, she went to Dayton, Ohio to work for some rich people as their servant. She wasn't allowed at the table. She was back there, okay? And then on the night that she died, she was anxious. She was afraid. She knew she was dying, but she no longer could speak English. She grew up speaking German, and none of us knew German anymore. I think my mom knew a little bit of it, but she was dying in a world where no one could speak to her, and she didn't recognize anyone. But then my mother did this amazing thing. She took a little cross off the wall, and she gave it to my grandmother, and that was the one thing she recognized. And she took that cross and she held it close to her. She held it next to her heart until she died. It gave her peace. I will never forget that. The cross goes deeper in than we know. how fortunate we are to have that gift. And so when there's pain, that's still an open wound. You know, it's not so much your words that you share, it's your presence that is the salve. And with your presence, you bring your story. And with your story, you bring the story of the Lord. And he does the rest. I'll just leave you with 8 o'clock right. I'll leave you with one image about the importance of just being there. There's a story in the gospel about this woman who was in need of healing, but she did not feel that she could approach Jesus face to face. You know the story. She worked her way through the crowd. She thought, if I could just touch the hem of his garment. And she was healed. Well, folks, a lot of times that's what we are. We are the hem of his garment. And we don't have to say a lot. Sometimes you don't have to say anything. But someone who reaches out to us because we are close to the Lord, they become close to the Lord, whether they realize it or not. We are the hem of his garment. And that brings healing about which we often don't realize and won't realize until we get to heaven someday. So never lose hope. It's not so much the words, but it's the story that you carry and the story in which you are carried. The story of Christ himself. What an honor. What a gift. What a gift. So, and it's been a gift for me to be with you all tonight. It's 8 o'clock and I don't want to keep you late, but gosh, thank you so much for coming. And last night I mentioned it's a wonderful time of the year to be paying attention to Mary. So let's pray the Hail Holy Queen together before we leave. In the name of the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit. Hail Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, our life, our sweetness, and our hope. To thee do we cry, poor banished children of Eve. To thee do we send up our sighs, mourning and weeping in this vale of tears. Turn then, most gracious advocate, thine eyes of mercy toward us. And after this our exile, show unto us the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. O clement, O loving, O sweet Virgin Mary. Pray for us, O Holy Mother of God. God bless you. In the name of the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah. All righty. Have a good Advent and even better Christmas.
Matt Seal is the one that donated
Yes.
artwork.
I